What we're here to talk about this afternoon is government-related entities. We have a new criteria, and what we wanted to do after we had rolled this out and after we had made the appropriate rating changes was to make sure that we had as much interaction with the investor and banker public as possible to clarify what we've done. Because what we did was we took an asset class, quasi-sovereigns, which can often be split up. We're a corporate group. We also at Fitch have a public finance group. We have an infrastructure group. And we wanted one umbrella criteria that pooled all of that together, because essentially we were doing the same thing with all of these entities in how we looked at them versus their state parents. So we had that one criteria aim. We pulled that together at the back end of last year, and we did take rating actions as a result, which we'll get into. We think the criteria is a lot more transparent than it was. And what we're going to be doing this afternoon is we'll go relatively quickly through some of the interesting points of the criteria. And then we'll look at some, if you like, individual cases and what are the interesting things that came out from our rating actions thereafter. Just before we start, I thought I'd throw this slide up. One of the reasons why we were keen to do this now is where we are in the credit cycle. And I'm frequently asked, have you noticed that corporate leverage is going up? And my answer is always, yes, we have noticed. We have adapted our ratings as a result. And actually, there are two probably most interesting slides here. The top one is rather busy, but it shows you the trailing 12-month upgrade-downgrade ratio. So if it's above the dotted black line, there were net upgrades. If it's below the dotted black line, there were downgrades. So you can see pretty much every region except the US has been in net negative rating territory for corporates since 2013. If you look at the bottom right, and this takes us closer to the GRE topic, that is the cumulative net rating actions. And again, it starts at zero, so the cumulative has, since 2013, always been in the red zone, always been negative. But what's interesting in that is if you look at the light-colored line as it slopes down, that's for developed markets. If you look at the dark-colored line, that's for emerging markets. So that, I think, gives us the context of when we sat back about 18 months ago now and looked at the $1 trillion plus of government-related entity debt that was out there in issuance, we felt it was important that before we get much further down the slopes of those lines, heading into late-stage credit cycle, we had a nice, robust way of looking at how these entities interact with their sovereigns. So, without further ado, to set the scene by looking at the criteria, Frédéric, on the topic of the factors we look at, in the past we seem to have we were very focused on control, you know, who the board members were, who was in charge. Is it fair to say, you know, is that still the case? Are there other things that have evolved in our view?
You will see that, yes, support is still something important, something we are looking at, but in a way, this shows more the history. And what we want to focus on in this new criteria is essentially what is the practical impact of a default. What happens if the GRE runs into difficulties? So we still have these two, I would say, more traditional factors of what is the ownership, what is the control, are all the decisions taken by government representative, or is it more managed commercially? But also, the tangible support. Historically, have we seen that the government has made sure that the entity has received enough support in order to maintain a reasonable financial profile? So this type of thing is still important. But more important, and these factors attract twice as much weight in our scoring system than the other two factors, are the social political implication of default and the financial implication of default, which I would say probably the area of the most innovative part of the criteria. And especially the social political implication of default, we were trying to put a bit more discipline in the thinking of the analyst when we talk about strategic importance. The strategic importance is something which is fairly vague. You can put almost anything in the strategic importance. And also, strategically important does not mean that a default would have major economic or social consequences. And I think a good example of that is if you think of a bridge linking an island from the mainland, clearly this bridge is strategically important. I mean, if the bridge disappears, it would create all sorts of economic problems. But at the same time, if the entity owning the bridge has lots of debt and defaults, the bridge is not going to collapse. I think this distinction between ability of the entity to provide the public service and default needs really to be very clearly distinguished.
So I guess that would work for, say, transmission companies as well then.
Yeah. So installed utilities which do not rely on buying externally their energy, let's say, or the feedstock, are less likely to see to cause major problems if they default than if, for example, let's say, if you have a refiner buying all the oil from externally from other countries. I mean, a default may create problem in the procurement, and then it could create problem downstream in the economy, which is relying on that refiner to provide the oil. Okay. So you see, this is the distinction here that we need to make, and the financial implication of defaults are more the contagion impact. So if one GRE default, does it mean that all the other GREs, that the state itself, would have problem in funding themselves? And in order to look at that, we need to broaden the horizon, not look only at the particular GRE, but look more at the structural aspect. So if a country like Korea, where you have many GREs with lots of debt, where the market perceives them as being essentially the same risk as the government, as being proxy funding vehicle for the government, and you see set in the spread, which are basically identical. If one of the GRE would default, this could create big tremors in the market, in the ability of the other entities to fund themselves, because it would break this assumption.
Okay.
So this is essentially the framework in terms of the various factors.
So that gives you 4 factors, and what do we do with those? So
we score these factors from weak to very strong, and the 2 factors, strengths of leakage factors, gets 0 to 10 points, and incentive to support factors get 0 to 20 points. So again, the higher weight we give to them. So then if you move to the next slide, then you will have essentially the core of the criteria, which shows you that you get this number of points, which are the various columns, but we also have, as in the second aspect, which I think we have also changed a bit compared with the previous criteria, is giving more emphasis to the standalone credit profile of the GRE we are looking at. Essentially, we are saying if you are strong on your own merit, you will probably need less support to get to the same rating to the sovereign than if you are weak. So, and secondly, the other aspect is that the 2 axes, so the standalone profile and the scoring, are not independent; they are dynamically linked. So, for example, if we see the standalone of a profile deteriorating to an extent when it becomes really concerning, then we would also revise certain of the scoring, and then it could move the needle. So it's not like when you have a top-down approach, you can just forget about the standalone. If the standalone does deteriorate to an extent where it again becomes worrying, where it becomes they are really concerned.
So what's your threshold for worrying, Frédéric? You're like a relaxed person, so.
Yeah.
Where does the standalone go to?
It's above D. So I would say
it's above D. Okay.
I would say probably triple C-ish starts being worrying. Yes.
Okay. And that would then sort of eat it. Would it just affect the support, or would there be other things that we would do because it reached triple?
Essentially, all the factors could be impacted by depending on why the entity got into the triple C. All the factors could be rescored down. If we see the standalone profile is rating so much, obviously tangible, the support track record, even potentially the control, because if they let the entity go, deteriorate so much, because it may be because they're not controlling it enough. Same thing for the last 2 factors, which although more structural, the impact of a default, it could mean that maybe the government does not perceive it as being so important. And therefore, who are we to say, it's very, very strong importance if the government does not even do what's necessary to maintain the entity with, let's say, a viable financial structure. So all the 4 factors could be impacted. And then, obviously, it would lead to potential change in the notching approach, the rating approach.
So we've been very focused on the downside here, the idea that there are a lot of companies where the sovereign can offer potential support. Obviously, there are many probably not as many, but there are many government-related entities who are actually quite strong in their own merits,
Yes.
and maybe stronger than the sovereign government where they're located. What happens with them?
Generally, unlucky for them, but they will probably, in most cases, be capped to the rating of their government parent. And it's not really anything new in this methodology. It's just that in our general parent-subsidiary linkage methodology, we say that when you have a weaker parent, which actually can control the cash flows, takes the money where it is, from its subsidiaries, even if the subsidiary is stronger, if the GRE in this case is stronger than the government parent, we never know. I mean, the government have so many levers it can use to extract the value from the GRE. Okay. So in most cases, the GRE would be capped at the rating of the parent.
I'm going to pause on that for a second. On that topic of how the scores came out, was there a particular pattern, Frédéric, with regard to
by industry, you mean?
Yeah, by industry or by region, or?
I mean, you can look at the next slide. Essentially, here it just shows the range of the scores in different sectors. And the first thing you can see is that it's typically very wide. So certain sectors tend to have very low score, like real estate, and this, at the end, it's really simple to understand. I mean, if it's a state-owned real estate company and it defaults, impact on the economy, not much. Somebody else will buy the properties. Yeah. Construction companies, again, the same. Generally, these are not crucial to the economy. Utility, energy, these two are interesting because this is where you have the widest range, where from being like 60 points, so the maximum you can get, to really low. The really low one would probably tend to be in Europe, also because of the state aid rules from the European Union, essentially preventing or at least making it more difficult from the government to provide the aid. And the highest one would tend to be the one where, as I described earlier in this presentation, when you have a big entity which represents a big portion of the energy, let's say, distribution to the economy, and at the same time is dependent on getting its feedstock from somewhere else. Okay. These ones tend to be very high. Food, also typically because of the importance of food, and you have food scare. I mean, especially from a government-owned entity, it's pretty bad. These tend to be scored fairly high. On industrial, again, very wide dispersion from, Chinese car companies. I mean, many of them is one default. It's not good, but you have substitute. It's a really commercial sector to an industrial company which would be specialized in defense, where defense being obviously strategic in this particular case and really important for the state, where the support will be most likely and unlikely that they would let a defense company, an important one, default.
Okay, so the whole portfolio was looked at. I guess an obvious question is, you've now applied all this lovely science, Fitch. Did any actual ratings change? A
few. So we had about 15% of the portfolio for which the rating was changed by one notch in almost all cases. In all cases, so it's not major changes, but just more like a question of consistency, perhaps. The 2/3 down, 1/3 up. Good examples of entities which were down. I think we have Codelco was one notch down in LATAM. I think we have in China the CGN, isn't it? So what's the new
China Nuclear Power?
China Nuclear Power. I think a few European ones, European utilities went up, but again, maximum by one notch. So I would say fairly moderate impact on the portfolio.